The speakers will set aside 10 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer questions. And we do encourage you to ask questions throughout the hour by typing them into the chat, and we will keep an eye on that. Please do the chat to everybody. And now I would like to turn this over to Antony Walsh from Eversheds UK office, and he will introduce the speakers and kick off the presentation. Again, Eversheds, thank you, Antony.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks everybody for having us. So you've got from Eversheds Sutherland today, myself, Antony Walsh, and my esteemed colleague, Marc Rawls. Marc and I are both M&A partners here at the firm, and we actually specialize in reorganizations and carve-outs. So we're delighted to address this audience today. And we are equally delighted to be joined by Chelse Ferrero from Cisco. Chelse?
Hi, yes, I am currently Senior Product Counsel for the Silicon and Optics Components business at Cisco Systems, but have been in-house for well over 10 years, practicing probably for 20. So hopefully I will add some practice pointers that I've picked up over the years.
Perfect. We've got a pretty action-packed agenda for you over the next hour or 50 minutes plus questions. So we are going to move through the slides at pace. We might even skip some of the slides, but the deck is here in full for your continued use. And Marc and I, and I'm sure Chelse too, but Marc and I will be delighted to take questions outside of this forum too, hence including the deck. Just one other point of housekeeping before we make a start is that you'll hear us talk here about spins and carve-outs interchangeably. And just to say that for these purposes, it means one and the same thing. Without getting too into the kind of nuances of it, a spin is where you carve out a division of a company and then separately list it, whereas a carve out colloquially is more often referred to carving out a part of a group for sale, perhaps to another trade buyer or a competitor. So spin typically involves a listing, and carve out typically involves a disposal of some sort, but they are the end points of the transaction, if that makes sense. And actually what we're going to be focusing on throughout this presentation is the reorganization and the splitting of that group into two branches, which is why you'll hear us talk about spins and carve-outs interchangeably. So with that in mind, what is a spin? Well, again, we've included the detail here, so I won't go into too much extra, but essentially a spin is realizing part of a group. So most companies operate, certainly most big companies operate in a group organization, and I'm sure your companies are all perfectly packaged by business unit, but frankly most companies aren't, and most companies grow quite organically. And what we typically find is that an industrials company, for example, starts to develop a technology part to their business, and that technology part to the business is just part of the overall group. And so a spin or a carve-out is trying to realize value essentially in that technology aspect, in my example, and allowing that part of the business to stand on its own 2 feet so that it can be independently realized financially. So let's just give you a couple of real life examples. Marc, I think you're going to talk about the first one.
Yeah, and the first one I'll talk about, and it's one that I think is pretty widely followed in the industry, was the 2017 merger of Dow and DuPont to form one of the world's largest chemical companies, and the 35th largest company in the Fortune 500. And their subsequent spinoffs of 3 very different businesses afterwards. They had DuPont, which was a plastics business. They spun out Dow, which is a commodity chemicals business. And then Corteva, which was an agricultural and seed and related chemicals business. All these companies after their spinoffs were listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So obviously this is the biggest of these examples that you could probably think of, but a lot of those lessons learned from that would apply to your smallest spinoffs that you'd have for even private companies. One thing I think is really interesting about this example that I'll mention before we go on to the next slides is that they've had 3 very different results so far. DuPont, one of them seems to be growing really fast, and DuPont. Dow seems to be materially strong, and Corteva seems to be the one that is lagging a bit behind. But one reason it's too early to know is there was a lot of expense incurred in the actual formation and implementation of those spinoffs, which is going to be a common theme that I think you hear throughout our presentation. And what that example really tells us is what importance you have to put on planning for reorganizations before you actually get into them. And even the biggest reorganizations with the most lawyers involved, et cetera, will always run into difficulties that are almost primarily and almost exclusively related to something that went wrong in the planning phase. Antony, the other examples, we've got a few.
Yeah, I've got a couple more examples. I'm just going to talk to one. So I actually acted on this particular project for Tenneco, and just to be clear, they've given me all the consents I need to be able to talk about it. So I acted on the acquisition of Federal Mogul for Tenneco, and that company was then left with 4 divisions. And actually one of the legacy Tenneco divisions and one of the Federal Mogul divisions sat well together, and then the other legacy Tenneco division and the other legacy Federal Mogul division sat very well together. So they then reorganized their entire business to then sit down those 2 lines. And you can then see that here in this second restructure chart, where in this case, we were preparing for a spin where the shareholders of the spin company literally then mirror the original shareholders to give the business a separate listing, but that is in the case of a spin as opposed to a regular carve-out. There's another example here of a transaction we did, but we'll skip that in the interest of time. And then just to prove that we've not just focused on the deals we've done, we've then included some materials from the press about the amount of this activity going on. Most of this press is from last year. I mean, just anecdotally, this continued right the way through 2019. It then continued into the beginning of 2020 at pace. Inevitably, it started to shut down for a period of time during COVID. But then actually one of the reasons why Marc and I were so keen to talk about this topic is that we've seen this then really come back with a bang. And indeed, you know, on the West Coast there, you've seen the project that Intel have just announced, for example. And we'll perhaps come on to talk about the reasons why you might spin now, because this potentially has changed. So again, I won't read off the slide because the slide deck will be there for you. But in terms of why you would do a carve-out or why you would do a spin transaction, in short, it's usually because you can realize better value from the carved out business. So back to my industrials company with a bit of technology in it, you know, an industrials company might trade at 4 times, for example, whereas a technology company would trade at 10 times. And so you tend to get activist shareholders who will say, well, hang on, this part of the business over here is undervalued because we're only getting 4x on our investment in the industrials company, and therefore that activist shareholder says you should spin that technology piece out so that we, the stockholders, can achieve greater value. And certainly before COVID, that was a big reason why these spins were happening. I think in a post-pandemic environment, we're likely to see more of this activity for a different reason, and that candidly is to try and shore up balance sheets. And you know, it may be that some of the corporates don't want to sell the technology part of their business in my example, but actually to keep their core business afloat and to have a healthy balance sheet, they're required to do that carve out to realize some cash. And then Chelse, you kindly identified a 4th reason why you've seen this in practice. So do you want to just mention that, please?
Yeah, so I see spinouts most often as part of antitrust merger clearance. Most of the spinouts that I have done is required to spin out a portion of the business that to clear a regulatory hurdle. And what's
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah,
about
well,
those type of spin outs is you have to do them very quickly. So
yeah, I guess that's the point. You have to do them, and you know that itself can then create a different competitive dynamic. So yeah, that's the broad reason. Just to give you perhaps an example of this, if you did want to take some time, if you look at the Volkswagen Automotive Group, Volkswagen owns lots of different car brands that you will recognize, including quite a few premium brands like a stake in Porsche and Lamborghini, for example. And Volkswagen and the Volkswagen Group board have been under some pressure to do something about that, because the theory is that if the Volkswagen Group was to parcel up all of its premium brands, so its stake in Porsche and its ownership of Lamborghini and I think Bentley, and if Volkswagen packaged those premium brands up into a separate tree, a separate group of companies for spin, that spin company would be worth more than the current Volkswagen Group as its entirety. And that always blows my mind, because how can one part of a company be worth more than the whole company of which it's already a part? But it's back to this point about valuation multiples. And, you know, with the greatest respect to anybody who drives a Volkswagen, you know, they are not aspirational cars in quite the same way. So the Volkswagen Group company doesn't attract the kind of premiums that a Lamborghini separately listed subsidiary would. So that's quite a tangible example of what we're coming up at.
What are you trying to say about my Passat, Antony? What are you trying to say about my Passat?
In terms of why you would do this, and I come back to the point about kind of activist shareholders or the need to sort of shore up balance sheets. We've just included some of the bare facts here around the kind of returns that you get on a spin transaction. And obviously this supports our view that in a lot of the cases, these spin companies do generate better returns for shareholders. Again, the tide's changing a bit. I think a lot of this now is going to be done because of COVID and shoring up balance sheets. But certainly over the last few years, these carve-outs have been very popular because the standalone spin entities have just generated much better returns for stockholders. And there's a couple of slides here which just emphasise that. So I'm not gonna talk through the same points there. So we've talked about what a spin or a carve-out is, and we've briefly talked about why you would do that from an economic perspective. And I guess it's then beholden on us as those alleged with experience to talk about some of the hurdles, because these projects are not straightforward. They take a long time, anything from kind of 6 to 18 months. These are quite complex projects. So Marc, why don't you start us off here talking about some of the common issues?
Certainly. And the bulk of any work in any spin files, just big picture, primarily into one of two buckets. So you've got sort of the pre-spin restructuring, the legal and operational work that you've got to do. And then you've got the spin itself. And this talk focuses really on the former. So the restructuring part, being the far more complicated, time-consuming and costly element, is what this talk will be primarily focused on. And a pre-spin restructure broadly is, you come across the same issues that you would with any type of restructuring. The difference that we've seen is that given the global and diversified nature of most spun businesses, the issues are usually magnified because of cultural and jurisdictional issues. So your operations in London and your operations in Japan, for example, may have different standards and ways that they're constructed. A lack of preconceived ring fencing. In other words, when we're talking about carving out a business, a lot of times those businesses aren't neatly within one subsidiary. Sometimes they cross multiple subsidiaries, and sometimes you've got a subsidiary that has multiple businesses. So you've got to figure out a way to carve it out of an individual, either corporation, LLC, partnership, et cetera. And frankly, it's just the sheer scale of the task at hand is the other issue that's really focused. We really see a lot of issues and complications that happen with restructuring. We'll focus today on some hot topics. We'll talk briefly about initial scoping, which is the structure of a spinoff, how you gather information and incorporate the skeleton structure into that. And we'll pretty quickly move into what I think, and it's boring, but I think it's probably a good way to describe it, which are these curveball issues that come up in almost every restructuring we have. So it's third-party consents of getting contracts moved to the right place, consents from landlords, from employees, from lenders, insurance companies, and those sorts of things. It's what do you do with global and shared arrangements? So if you've got an enterprise-wide insurance policy, for example, how do you deal with dividing that out and highlighting that as an issue, as a complication for a spin? Employee consultation, benefits, and union issues are always things to focus on. And then there's a few issues that aren't quite as obvious of value consideration, distributable profits, and the things that are actually involved in actually making dividends and distributions of different entities to get them into the right place. You've got treasury and finance issues of letters of credit, bank accounts, etc. And then you've got the pesky IT issues, intellectual property issues that are associated with these sorts of things as well.
Yeah, I'll just go on a limb there to say that the long pole in the tent on all of these things is always IT, and nobody ever believes me, and it's always IT systems. But Chelsea, I know you've got some experience here as well on a practical basis.
Yeah, so from an in-house perspective, if you see a spinoff coming up, you have a line of sight, start early and engage your counsel. Outside counsel is really going to run these deals for you. They're complex, and from an in-house perspective, just supporting outside counsel is a ton of work because it hits on so many areas. And the in-house counsel expertise is in several of these areas, will be leveraged, but there is a lot of work here to be done.
Perfect.
I think,
Keep
go ahead, Antony.
No, please go ahead, Marc. I think, let's just get into some of these common issues. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was going to say that actually kicks off nicely to the very beginning of one of these projects. And I think outside law firms such as ourselves, we do have a big hand in sort of structuring that, along with the accounting firms, the E&Ys and the KPMGs and the others that are helping to put together these steps and make sure that they work from an accounting perspective. And that project management piece is probably the key piece. As Antony said, that IP and IT issues become an issue at the very beginning, understanding who's responsible for what, who's going to manage the data that's flowing in, and even the practicalities at the very beginning of who even actually executes the documents and how they're going to be executed. In some jurisdictions, you're going to require powers of attorneys, notaries, whether electronic execution, particularly in this COVID era, is going to be required. These are all things that we really emphasize our clients focus a lot of time on at the beginning, at a period where they're just trying to get their heads around how this is going to work. The more work you can do at the beginning, the better.
I want to jump in on that point. Having your lawyers and your accountants work together at the outset is paramount to running these deals. Oftentimes that is overlooked, and you have your lawyers running in sort of, one line, and you have your accountants over here, and there's overlap. They really approach things from a different perspective. And what you do is you get a lot of churn if they are not sitting at the same table from the outset. So, if you don't want to have to unwind all the overlap and all of the complaining about one another, just get everyone in the same room from the beginning.
So Chelsea, what you're arguing is it may be worth paying a few extra billable hours in order to make sure you've got a well-run reorganization.
So I always say you pay less if you engage early, and you pay less if you engage up front than to clean up the mess that you create on the back end by not doing it right from the beginning.
Agreed. And we'll talk briefly, and this is really an example. I mean, the most basic type of transaction that you have is something as simple as what you got here, which is X transfers the stock of Y to Z in exchange for shares. Seems like a completely simple example. It's something that happens in almost every reorganization in some way that we work with. But one of the examples that we worked on, for example, we had transfers that were taking place in the Czech Republic. In just that one transaction of X transfers the stocks of Y to Z in exchange for shares, took nearly 2 weeks of us calls, structuring calls, and understanding how this innocent sentence actually translated into structuring. And in that example, that was 1 page of a 410-page step paper to give you an idea of the level of planning that some of this stuff requires. And the initial scoping to give people an idea, and some people may be familiar with these and some may not. So I do think it makes sense to touch on this briefly. There's obviously transfers of assets and shares out of various and into various subsidiaries, but there are distributions of profit, contributions of capital, in some situations, contributions of kind. And depending on the jurisdiction, a number of different ways that you can basically get the operations that you want from one place to another. And so just want to put a little bit of a bug in everyone's head that a lot of times it's not just as easy as an asset transfers from A to B or stock transfers from A to B. It can take a number of different forms depending on tax and other structuring considerations. Another thing that I would briefly highlight, and maybe Chelsea, you can speak to this as well, on the next slide is our historic liabilities, and where the liabilities for a particular business operation would fall. One of the examples I always like to call on is I have one client that had a fairly significant operation that has some asbestos liabilities from decades and decades ago. Some of those liabilities are still hanging around, and one of the most complicated parts of the restructuring was figuring out whether to allocate those liabilities with the current business that it was housed in, or whether to move that out. And understanding the specific historic liabilities of your business is oftentimes not something people are thinking about on a day-to-day basis, especially when those liabilities, there hasn't been a phone call from someone to talk about those liabilities in some time. So really being able to go back and looking at the history of your company and figuring out what the business agreement is amongst the operation and the folks that are advocating for various aspects of the spin out is really important. And you also run into situations, and Chelsea may have some thoughts about this as well, where the management for the spun off business and the management for the business that's remaining have a different of opinion about who should get the ultimate liabilities that are going to cause some problems in the future. But Chelsea, you had some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so liabilities are always a big bone of contention. So it depends. So, right, because you spin off, there's usually a buyer typically on the other side of most of these. And they're not going to want the liabilities. And so it affects the whole overall deal price. And sometimes, depending on the liabilities and if they have lawsuits attached, you can't just transfer them. So, it gets messy. I would say, I mean, overall, just know that it will affect deal price. And so it's a negotiation.
Yeah,
and then you do the best that you can.
And I mean, we'll come on to some specific examples of this, but all I'm going to say on these topics is all of the issues we're talking about now just kind of grow exponentially as soon as you start doing these projects across border. So even something as simple as intragroup debt, in the States, if there was intergroup debt and we wanted to get rid of it, we just do that. Well, in Germany, you're not allowed to do that. So, you imagine a situation in Germany where you think you've cleared some intragroup debt, you sell the carved out company. 2 years later, the new owner of that carved out company looks at the accounts. They see that intragroup debt was waived, not settled. Guess what? They can sue you for that unpaid debt. So,
It's also interesting if you are acquiring a spun out business, you want to be very careful what liabilities you take on because, as the buyer or the purchaser, because, let me tell you, whoever's spinning out the business is going to try and put everything they do not want into that spin out. And I have seen just, that's where the hidden disasters go. So really look at that liabilities list and do your due diligence on them. Dig in.
And I think what you're hearing there is a lot of talk, and I think this is going to be a common theme about what you do to actually scope the information and scope what the transaction is, including historic liabilities. And some businesses are very sophisticated. Everybody's got all of their contracts in the right place. They're all under the right names. The assets are in the correct subsidiaries. Everyone knows what's going on. My tendency and belief is that that's not the norm. In my experience, and I don't know if Antony and Chelsea's is the same. So that information gathering process and really understanding what the structures are is crucial, particularly across jurisdictions. EMEA may have a different system to APAC, which has a different system to the Americas. And so a clear and uniform information request list that is translatable, for lack of a better word, across jurisdictions is crucial, including the points of receipt of all the information that's coming in. Chelsea had talked earlier about getting the law firms and the accounting firms cooperating with each other. And I think one of the smartest things that the clients that are really on top of their game do is to make sure they've got one point person at each of the law firms and the accounting firm that is their go-to. Everybody sends the information there. And that person then coordinates with their colleagues to make sure that all of those things get done. And a big part of that process, that early process, is not just the collection of data, it's actually the generation of what I think Andy and I think of as the skeleton structure, which is the setting up of all the new corporations, it's the setting up of bank accounts, tax registrations, making sure that a valid home for intellectual property and intellectual and information technology assets has been established. And that planning process of working with each jurisdiction to understand where things need to go and how that corporate skeleton is supposed to be set up is also a really, really important part to avoid issues. I mean, in the United States, as everybody I think on this call knows, Delaware is a great place to set up businesses. So a lot of places default to Delaware for a number of legal and corporate reasons, but we have a lot of clients that need to have their locations and their corporations in Georgia for political and other reasons. They want to say that they've got a Georgia corporation that's doing their business. That type of thing, and talking to the operations about that structuring skeleton at the beginning is actually something that a lot of times is saved to the end. And yeah, we know where the assets are. We'll figure out where to set up the corporations and the bank accounts near the end. No, those should be part of the initial scoping questions. And to be honest, that should be part of the uniform request list that's sent to the operations, business, and legal teams when you're gathering the information. So what are the sensitivities that we need to know about in terms of locations of accounts, in terms of locations of corporations, even in terms of the type of corporations that you set up to receive assets, are all things that you should be thinking about at the beginning.
Well, I just want to point out also in the initial scoping is, from an in-house perspective, you need to keep an eye on, okay, what's the end purpose of the spinoff? Is it going to be standalone or will it not be? Because I think a lot of things that's missed from the initial scoping list is getting all the support functions, for example, that you might need. A lot of times they'll do a spinoff and there's no HR, or there's no IT, there's no legal support. I mean, it happens more often than you think, and so you think, oh, I have the standalone business, but I don't have any of the support function people to do the work, and that's not a standalone. So
you don't want to just sort all of that out with a transitional services agreement, because if the parent is just then providing all of those services to the spin or carve-out company under a transitional services agreement, well, arguably you haven't really moved things much further forward.
So I agree. I don't like transitional services agreement. They're necessary, right, in a lot of instances, but you need a plan. You need a long-term plan. There's been a lot of big reorganizations and spinoffs. I think Laird was one in particular where they spun off the largest part of their business with no lawyers. Well, how are you going to do your day-to-day business when day one you have no lawyers? So you're doing it under transitional services, and those lawyers don't know your business and they have other jobs. I mean, it becomes a mess. You need a long-term plan with people behind it.
Agreed. And one of the areas that we're going to just focus on here briefly to that effect is around employees, and this will also give a bit of insight into how exponentially harder this all gets as soon as you kind of cross borders. So I've already declared my hand somewhat and said that I think the key gating item on most of the projects I end up working with is IT separation. And I can almost hear people in the audience saying, no, that doesn't apply to my business. My business is really straightforward and the IT is already nicely segregated. Not going to happen. I'm doing one of these projects at the moment for a client, and I was making this point and the client was disagreeing with me. And then I'm partnering with another one of the big US firms, and that partner also then joined the call, and he said exactly the same thing, and the client felt kind of ganged up on, but for all the right reasons. IT is it's a long lead time item on these projects. One of the other long lead time items, though, definitely is employees. And, you know, without wishing to patronize anybody, you know, in the US, you all have such an relatively easy ride in terms of the way you get to deal with employees in these projects. And I'm sure anybody who's then worked internationally knows it's a very different regime outside of the States. You know, the UK, which is where I originally practiced, I sort of split my time now in Chicago, but you know, the UK is pretty straightforward as well. But as soon as you get into places like France and Germany and the Netherlands and Spain and Italy and frankly the rest of the world, then it becomes quite a bit harder. And I always pick on the French at this point because it's kind of my duty in life to do so. And you know, France is an example where, you know, you can't do a carve-out without consulting with the French Works Council. That's okay. We can kind of get our heads around that, right? But to get to that point, you know, you need to be consulting with the French Works Council. So that means you need to tell them, and they won't offer you a duty of confidentiality. So if you're a listed PLC, how does that work? Because you're releasing price sensitive information to somebody who's not affording you any confidentiality. So there's kind of practical issues like that to work out. And then the other point, of course, is, you know, we work hand in glove with the accountants on all of this. And again, anybody who's seen one of these kind of 400-page decks knows that they change almost weekly. And, you know, you'll be on version 60 by the time you close the project. And that's, again, fine. We all understand that these things evolve. But remember, in somewhere like France, you've got to go to the employees with a completed solution. So if you go on day one and it's a 3-month process, and then the deck changes on day 40, well, guess what? You have to start your 3-month process again in France. And so, you know, back to Chelsea's point at the start about kind of project management, you know, you really, really do need to be kind of top of your game in just understanding all of these kind of timing requirements. And I think, Chelsea, that probably does segue back to what you were talking about, you know, involving the support functions.
It does. And I also wanted to, you know, you reminded me of also a point that I've forgotten intentionally, labor unions. You know, you forget that, you know, in many other countries, labor unions have to approve all of these deals before you take them to your employees. So Japan, China, in particular, and you have to negotiate with them, right? They have to agree, and they'll have influence on it. So it's a process that you have to be prepared for.
Perfect, thank you. Marc, do you want to carry on then with some of the other issues? I mean, I think, again, we're doing okay for time, but just in the interest of time,
yeah, and we can move quickly through some of these. I think everybody is pretty aware of the idea that you're going to have to get probably some third-party consents depending on the structure of the transaction, from customers, landlords, regulatory permits, those sorts of things, lenders. These are all consents that you may or may not have to obtain as part of a spinoff. And knowing what your approach is to that process is going to be an important part of what you're looking at during that planning and diligence phase. So we won't go into a lot of details about the different types of sort of consent structure or plans that you would like to sort of approach with. But I think on the next slide, we've got a few high-level things for you to be thinking about. And these are things that seem pretty straightforward. You know, do you obtain a consent? Is it explicit consent? Is it formal? Do you get an email? Do you send an email off that says, unless you have any objections, we're going to do this? And you sort of frame your consent structure in that way. And depending on the jurisdiction, there's obviously a lot of differences in the way that the consent process works as well. I think one of the real upsides that I would say that's important for everybody to be thinking about as part of this process is, what is your materiality level? Because the reality is, in businesses big and small, it's probably going to be impossible to cross every T and to dot every I when you're doing one of these reorganizations, so that you've got every third-party consent that you would have if you were doing everything perfectly. So the materiality process is really important.
Yeah.
And I've certainly seen that in practice. And again, to Mark's point, it is the jurisdictional points. And again, things are relatively easy in the States and then get harder outside, where, to transfer a contract in Europe, for example, you would need the consent of the customer or the consent of the supplier to make that change. And that's okay. And, I did one of these spins year before last, and we had 4,000 contracts. So we used some AI to help kind of populate that process. And to Mark's point, the client took a view, they weren't going to wait around for all 4,000. I just completed another one on October 2nd, though, and that particular client, their whole business only had 27 contracts. And so, they had a very, very different kind of risk tolerance, and they did copper bottom this, and they went out and they got explicit consent from each of those 27 customers to make sure this was all valid. And again, Chelsea, I know you've seen this in practice.
Yeah, so commercial agreements really in-house counsel can, this is something that we can leverage our knowledge of the business. I wish it was always so simple that, oh, here are our contracts, and then, here's our consent structure, and we'll just, send out our letters and we're good to go. Every deal that I ever touch, it's much messier than that. Oftentimes there's agreements, more often than not, that the parent company still needs to retain. And yet they have to spin it out. So it becomes complicated, really complicated quickly. Because, then what do you do? So there's a couple ways you can approach it. One is you can amend the agreement and split out terms. Okay, for these products, right? This agreement will go on, we'll transfer through these products, parent retains the rest. Sometimes it's easier to put a new agreement in place and have an agreement for a new agreement with the spin out company. But that also takes time, and not all companies will, customers or suppliers will agree to that. But this becomes high touch, especially for going to Antony's point about materiality. You really have to rank at this point your deals. If you have 4,000 contracts, then what are your top 100 suppliers? What are your top 100 customers? And that's where you really need to focus your time, because usually the smaller suppliers and customers will kind of follow, right? They'll fall in once once the spin out goes. I also want to make a sort of a randomly obvious practice point or tip. When you do a spin out, make sure all the contracts are actually transferred with the business, copies of them. This sounds really simple, but I've been on both sides of really large spin outs where this didn't occur because they were so large. So when you have 4,000 contracts, okay, that you end up transferring or assigning, you sent over, I don't know, 3,000 of them. Well, that's good enough. I actually have a not so funny story of a really large patent litigation where the company I was at, that was spun off, did not have a copy of a patent. We had sub-license rights to a patent that was subject to this huge litigation. And we didn't know that we had sub-license rights to this patent, and we could have sub-licensed it to our suppliers, and made the whole thing go away. Perfect, a really good example. We just didn't have a copy.
Yeah, I agree with that. See it kind of day in, day out. I think, Marc, here you've kindly listed just some of the other key areas where we need to focus.
Yeah, and I'll talk on this briefly, and being mindful of the time. A common driver in spinoffs is that you have the two resulting groups, or three or four, whose interdependencies are cut to the greatest extent possible. But there are always going to be some areas where obtaining a clean split on day one may be not as straightforward. And these are some of the ones that I've listed. So shared property, where you're in the same facility, global suppliers and customers, one of Antony's favorites in terms of IT services and shared servers, that sort of thing, and in particular payroll and HR systems. So identification of these places, and I mean, this is to the dreaded TSA concept that oftentimes accompanies almost any reorganization you have for a period. But identification of those dependencies should form a really key part of the operational and legal due diligence that's undertaken during the validation phases. And these are everything from IT servers and payrolls that can be temporarily serviced under TSA agreements or in connection with discussions with the payroll and employee agencies that may be handling those functions. But there are even other legal dependencies that are far more complicated, especially in the time of COVID. So the emphasis that I'm seeing and the ones that I've done recently were on shared spaces and who was responsible for COVID protections, who was responsible for making sure that folks that were exposed were tested and appropriately quarantined. What do you do when you have a shared facility and you're supposed to be operating those facilities as two completely different animals? And so that's something that I think is increasingly, particularly over the next 18 months, going to be a key part of any type of reorganization spinoff is how do we deal with the COVID effect when it comes to personnel and shared services. So I did want to put that on the list as something to have at top of mind.
Yeah, thank you. That was your point, Chelse, was to look at this in the long term.
Yeah, to look at it with TSA agreements, just make sure that you have a long-term plan always in place, especially with shared property, because what you find is when a company is spun out, all of a sudden their interests are totally they diverge very quickly, shall I say, from the parent company. And I've seen scenarios where, within the first year, they need to sell off property that's shared. And they're still under TSA services agreements. And they don't have the rights to make now necessary business judgments for this new business. So you need to, TSA agreements are good. They need to be short and they need to have a plan behind them.
Yeah.
And sharing perpetually is not a good idea. There needs to be a split.
Yeah, you need to realize that value. Thank you. And then, looking at some of the employee option points again, I won't go into this in kind of any great detail, but in a carve-out, you typically end up with a blend of some stock deals where you're transferring subsidiaries and then some asset transfers when you're moving assets out of one company into a new co. And typically speaking, moving stock is relatively easy from an employee perspective because the employees just sit in the company. But again, internationally, even a change of shareholder in a stock deal can require employee consultation. So, just these kind of curveballs and landmines to watch out for. Certainly on asset deals, you're definitely going to have to consult with employees, particularly internationally, and that can take kind of many months. And again, we're then into the kind of practicalities of, well, how do you go about that in the context of a project which might be in some state of flux in terms of the design of the final stages. I guess the one thing I wanted to mention specifically here was redundancies. Again, in the States, when you're doing these kind of restructurings, we're used to possibly doing some redundancy type actions at the same time to streamline the business. Internationally, again, that is much, much harder. If you take the UK, for example, a kind of redundancy in the context of one of these transfers is probably automatically unfair, or certainly carries the risk of it being automatically unfair. So you actually can't make these kind of redundancies in association with this type of deal, and does that have an impact? Then I've mentioned here kind of pensions, and actually one of the questions I've had here relates to how you deal with pension arrangements. So I'll briefly mention that. Pension arrangements is back to the kind of historic liabilities point that we mentioned at the start. So there's kind of two issues here. Is one, the spin co is going to have to offer access to some kind of pension type scheme. So to Chelsea's practical points, you're going to need to have that in place. You're going to need to have that stakeholder scheme. You're going to need to have people within the spin co who can administer all that kind of pension. But then if you've got a defined benefit pension scheme, well, you're then into splitting that scheme. And again, one of the points Chelsea made earlier is you do then end up with proper negotiation going on. And it's really interesting actually for General Counsel in particular, because General Counsel sitting there as the GC of the whole group in preparation for a spin, and he or she is thinking then, right, how do we split these pensions? How do we get part of the pension into NewCo into SpinCo. But of course, the GC sits at the top, and she might then be thinking, well, I'm staying with RemainCo, so do I want all of this to go to SpinCo? And you can almost end up in a situation where there are some internal conflict of interest issues here. But the short answer on the pensions is that most governments, most countries, should I say, have have legislation which we can then follow to split these pension schemes, and it's usually contractually done then to support that legislative framework. Just conscious of time, so I will just skip then onto the next slide, Marc.
Yeah, and I think this is one, and if anybody perks up about something, one of the things that I like to highlight on this slide is actually discussing things that might actually cause personal liability for various officers and directors and others that might be involved in the transaction, and that is the question of value. So if you're distributing just from 1,000 foot perspective in the US, obviously, if you've got a dividend or other distribution, the company that's making that dividend or distribution has to be solvent. And a lot of times when the planning of how this stuff is going on, that solvency question is actually one of the last things that a lot of the businesses are actually thinking about. They're just trying to get things in the right place, but they're not thinking about the fact that if we distribute a number of large subsidiaries out of a holding company, that may actually leave that entity being insolvent. And in many jurisdictions, if you are making either a written consent that you're signing or a resolution or otherwise sort of confirming that after a distribution or dividend that your company is going to be solvent, there could actually be personal liabilities for our officers and directors that are making those sorts of pronouncements. And one way to show the value to your business clients of what you as an in-house lawyer provides value on is anytime you say to them, let's be careful of this because we don't want you to get personally in trouble. Which is why this value proposition is actually one of the things that I think you have to be really focused on. And it takes sometimes because of the business, the way that they think of value and the way that a particular statute may require you to value assets to make a distribution, may be two very different things. So they may be looking at their balance sheets and thinking, oh, this is fine, but they're looking at it from a business and operational perspective, as opposed to what the actual statutory requirements of a particular jurisdiction in the US, Delaware, for example, has a very specific set of statutes and codes, which specifically delineate when you can make a distribution and when that's allowable. And the board of directors needs to be able to validate that. So those discussions and making sure that your business team understands how that works, I think is very key.
And that segues nicely then into some of the broader treasury issues. And Chelse mentioned earlier on about getting all relevant stakeholders involved, and lawyers, accountants, yes. And then from the client side, we've already identified, IT need to be involved, the labour part of the business needs to be involved, clearly legal need to be involved. Treasury is then one of the other big stakeholders in all of this. In 99% of the examples, bank consent will be required to any kind of carve out, whether that leads to a sale or a spin. So there's the basic kind of, bringing the bank into the tent and getting their consent. But then actually there's much more nuanced issues then actually within the treasury functions. So, one of the things Marc and I spend a lot of time doing is putting in cash pooling arrangements, for example, for businesses on a global basis. Well, guess what? As soon as you then fracture that group, those cash pooling arrangements need to be mirrored on each side of the separated trees. And as Chelse said, you wouldn't want any of that intercompany financing to exist post-spin. So, you need to have it on both sides. So, I won't go into any more detail. Suffice to say, all the kind of third-party financing needs to be split. The only thing just to remind you all of, though, was the point I made earlier, which is on the international side, dealing with some of these intra-group finances and financing issues, and the way you deal with them, the way you extinguish those loans or get rid of them. There are some landmines you need to watch out for when you're trying to do some of that internationally. Marc, we then do come to my favorite topic of IP.
Well, I'll briefly give some thoughts on IP, and then you may have some follow-ups, Antony and Chelse, definitely. And as Antony said, I mean, IP is one of the most consistent challenges we see in the pre-spin restructuring aspect of the processes. Some businesses have a very clear and defined IP structure with a central IP entity and intra-group licensing agreements that are very formalized, but most we find do not. And this is being complicated right now, particularly in the US, by recent developments. So for example, in the US, offshore holding of intellectual property is now being discouraged in a number of ways, between tax structuring and de-incentivizing certain licensing mechanics that were allowing people to license from an internal IP entity to another and take certain tax advantages from that. A lot of that is being shut down, and a lot of it is to bring intellectual property, at least in the US, onshore. So a lot of the reorganizations that we're doing are also being sort of paralleled by a lot of reorganizational thinking that relates to IP. And for the biggest client that I've got, bar none, they're contemplating spinoffs that are going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years. And all of the reorganization work that we're doing right now is specifically to get the IP in the right place. And they see that as an 18 to 24 month process, just to show you how complicated that can be. So I'll take a moment and let Antony and Chelse give their thoughts because IP is so important.
I'm going to invite Chelse to do so, because I think, Chelse, you think this is the hard part too. So go ahead.
I do. So IP, and I'm going to leave IT to you, Antony, because I agree. IT is always a mess. I mean, that is, so I'm going to give that one to you. But for IP, you know, a couple things, a couple ways to approach looking at, for example, your patent portfolio. You know, obviously you want to target, you know, certain technologies that you want to, you know, put with that for whatever, you know, products that are going with your spin out. That sometimes is a little harder to do than it sounds easy, but it's not. And then you have a bunch of just sort of patents, you know, generally speaking, if you're at a large company, and what do you do? You know, I usually see sort of a hybrid approach with spin-outs, where you look at your whole portfolio, you identify the key technologies, you put that in your spin-co, and then you take the gray area patents and you do sort of a one for me, one for you. And then a really good practice pointer is to do a broad cross-licensing agreement between the spin-co and the parent company, because you really don't know what you need or what you're using until you really spin it out. And as the parent company, you don't want to lose key patents. And you certainly do not want to be sued on those key patents a year later, because, you know, there's some, you know, because, you know, you guys, it's not, because it was not an exact science when you carved up your patent portfolio. So that's also, well, that's my practice pointer there. Also be careful of assignment restrictions in existing licensing agreements. That also becomes something that really just needs to be looked at, about, okay, what licensing agreements are in place, and, you know, will they apply to the spin-co or will they not, and how to handle it. And you kind of have to look at those on a case-by-case basis. So again, this becomes usually a focus, you know, a big in-house focus, because they understand the technology and usually the patent portfolio best. So you just kind of want to make sure that you reserve time to look at this issue carefully.
Thank you. Okay, and then I think, Marc, I'm just going to skip you here, because this is environmental issues, and I think environmental issues is just an example of the kind of historic liabilities point. And I think we've talked previously about how we divide up historic liabilities, whether they are pensions liabilities or indeed in this case environmental liabilities. But as I said at the top, everybody's then got the deck, so we've kind of got the details. We've been talking here then about some of the kind of practicalities of getting to spin, and we've been talking about, you know, the large group that's typically involved and stakeholders. And that does then come back to project management and data volume. There's a heck of a lot, and I'm determined not to get into any kind of advertising to the firm, but, you know, Marc and I benefit from having toolkits available to us to help us to manage this level of data. And I mentioned the kind of AI earlier. So, you know, when I did my 4,000 contracts, we also looked at over 900 leases. and all of that. It took about 2 weeks to kind of code the AI, and then you press a button and it's done. But that is very different to having 100 attorneys poring over that on hourly rates for 4 months. So with proper adoption of technology, you can really drive some efficiencies here. And again, when it comes to execution logistics, particularly when you start working internationally, notaries need to be booked. So that means they need to be booked in advance, which means they need all sorts of documents to deliver to them before they're prepared to sign off, because they take personal liability. And you need to be able to see these processes in real time to then benefit from things like electronic execution. So there's a big plug there for getting the right kind of project management tool. And I think just drawing some conclusions, I'm then going to skip on to questions. I think I'm going to steal what Chelsea said about don't underestimate the time. I think back to the point I've just made about planning and establishment of systems, I think that's really important. Interrogating the steps from every angle. We mentioned treasury, we mentioned labour, your tax team. We haven't talked about tax. I've got a VAT question here, which I'll talk to. Collation of information in a uniform way. It's really difficult if IP are applying one materiality threshold and then contracting are applying another. You need to set these things up at the highest level so that everybody's working to the same mantra. Watch out for employees, particularly internationally, and then curveballs. Don't be surprised by curveballs because you'll get loads, but just make sure you've got the kind of time and the planning then to deal with those. I just want to pick up on a couple of the specific questions. We've had a question about VAT. Now, you could spend an hour talking about that on these projects. I guess from a high level perspective, most of the time when you're dealing with these transfers, you're either doing a stock deal, which wouldn't attract VAT, or when you're doing an asset deal, you are typically transferring a going concern. So if you're transferring individual assets, a printer, so you have a really obvious example. If you're just transferring that asset, that single transaction is likely to attract VAT. If though you've got a corporate box which has some manufacturing in it and some technology in it, and you're transferring out the technology part of that business, typically you're transferring contracts, the people, the intellectual property, etc. And when you're transferring a business as a going concern in that way, providing you get the drafting right in the transfer agreement, that should be VAT neutral. So VAT is really important on these transactions, but it's rarely a hard cost, if that makes sense in the context of the overall deal. So I think, Kerry, we've kind of got some other questions here, but I'm really conscious of time, so I want to make sure we do finish on time, and you're kind of going to say a word in conclusion.
Yeah, do we have time for one more question, or?
Let's do one.
I see we've got maybe 2 or 3 questions that are waiting in the chat room that I can sort of read off to you and Antony and Chelsea.
Yeah, I can take real quickly the IP questions and cross-licensing questions just really quickly on patents. There's a question: when do we start a review of IP? As soon as possible. The larger the portfolio, especially if it's a large parent company with a smaller spin-off, no matter how well organized your patent portfolio is, no one has every patent characterized down to every product and technology. So expect it to take a large amount of time. So start early and engaging in the various resources. And on patent cross licenses, usually you have to, you don't want to transfer them right to the SpinCo because the parent still needs the protection of a patent cross license. So you have to go back, whoever your cross license is, and you usually ask for an amendment that covers that SpinCo out. Because you say, hey, right, they were covered as a subsidiary. There's no difference. There's no change in state. They're just now a standalone independent or chunk that goes with it. One thing that's tough is though when that spin out goes into another large company, oftentimes, right, you cannot get that patent protection to extend to the rest of whoever the purchaser is. It will just cover that business unit. So, and that's standard. So don't be
I was going to say, in one answer to one of the questions I see about the importance of a spin leader, I'll address that briefly. Extremely important to have spin leaders. And in fact, I would recommend a business spin leader, a legal spin leader, and oftentimes you'll have an accounting finance sort of leader, so that you can have sort of central repositories of each of those three silos. So best case scenario, you've got one person who's the only neck that gets throttled if something goes wrong or that there's a call to make. But the best situations that I've seen is when you have a legal lead that is a spin leader. You've got an operational, either operational accounting or finance lead. That's kind of a co-spin leader. So actually having two that are able to sort of handle those two roles, I think has been the most efficient way that I've seen it done.
Those people then meet, as a weekly board, for example. So again, quite often I'm expected, or Marc's expected, we're expected to kick issues up to our legal lead, for example, on a Wednesday, because she's got a leadership board meeting for the spin management group on a Thursday, for example. So I'd certainly endorse that.
Yeah.
Kerry?
So I think, Kerry, if you keep us together, that might be our time.
Yes, that would be time, but thank you very much. What we will do is, if there were more questions in the chat, we will connect with those members who post the questions and see if they'd like us to connect them directly to you, so you can follow up directly. But thank you, everyone, and thank you to Eversheds Sutherland